Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website. Reminding you, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And for those in-house, the only reminder is please silence or turn off our mobile devices as a courtesy to our speaker. Hosting our program today is Dr. Niall Gardner. Dr. Gardner is director of our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He is a former aide to Lady Thatcher. He has worked at the heart of the Washington policy world for over a decade and is a leading expert on the U.S.-UK special relationship. Dr. Gardner is also a regular contributor to the London Daily Telegraph and appears frequently on American and British television. Please join me in welcoming Niall.
Thanks very much, John. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom here at the Heritage Foundation. It's my great pleasure to introduce my very good friend, Dan Hannan, member of the European Parliament for South East England. Dan is the author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World, and the Sunday Times bestseller, Vote Leave. His latest book is What Next? How to Get the Best from Brexit. I've known Dan since we were students at Oriel College in Oxford. He is a man of tremendous principle and conviction, someone whose formative years were during the Thatcher Revolution of the 1980s. And like the Iron Lady, Dan is a true patriot, driven above all by love for his country. It was this deep-seated dedication that drove him to play a lead role in the campaign for Britain to leave the European Union. Indeed, Dan was one of the very first British voices to call for a referendum on EU membership, despite putting his own job at risk. And I think his job will be gone within a couple of years, Dan. The Brexit vote on June 23rd last year struck a great blow for sovereignty and freedom. It was a huge victory for the principle of self-determination, as well as an emphatic rejection of the notion that the British people should be subject to the rule of unelected bureaucrats sitting in Brussels with imperial impunity. When the British people are finally free of the shackles of the EU, they will have Dan and his fellow Conservative rebels to thank for their freedom. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Hannan. Thank you.
Well, Niall, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's always a pleasure to be here. Heritage has been the strongest friend and the staunchest supporter of the cause of British independence on this side of the Atlantic. I remember standing exactly where I'm standing now in January 2001 and making the case for why Britain should leave the European Union. And believe me, in those days, this was about the only place where you could get a sympathetic hearing in this town for that point of view. And gradually, it's expanded and become almost a mainstream position. And I well remember that on the day of Brexit, this building was flying the Union flag, and we learned on that day who our friends are. And we know, well, we didn't learn about you, we knew already, but it was a wonderful affirmation and confirmation of our long-standing relationship. So thank you to Niall, thank you to all of you involved in Heritage. I want to talk about something that I think is the central fact of all of our lives, the almost miraculous wealth that has been untapped by commerce and specialization, and the opportunities that will now come to your country and mine as Britain pursues its vocation as an independent global free trading nation. 10,000 years ago, one of our ancestors made the extraordinary discovery that if you put seeds in the ground, plants would grow in the same place. It was the beginning of what we now call civilization. It was the beginning of towns, the beginning of writing. But I'm afraid it took only about 5 minutes before somebody made the next discovery, which is that it's easier to steal somebody else's crop than to spend all year tending to and harvesting your own. Human nature being what it is, it wasn't long until the really fateful discovery was made, which is that if you really want to maximize the ratio of effort to outcome, you regularize the theft of everybody else's crops through tithes and tolls and taxes. And thus was human civilization born in tyranny. And thus it was to continue for the better part of 10,000 years. Look back at the great, towering, lapidary monuments of the ancient civilizations, the pyramids and the great victory arches of the classical civilizations, you think of the human misery and the slave labor required to have erected any of those monuments. For the better part of 10,000 years, the lot of our species was oppression and caste and serfdom and bondage. And then came the miracle, the extraordinary idea that instead of human relations being mediated by birth, by tradition, by caste, we could be treated as autonomous individuals, free to make bargains one with another on an individual and one-off basis. In other words, that we were autonomous. And from that discovery came not only human freedom, but a degree of prosperity that had been unimaginable. Until about 200 years ago, almost everyone excluding the wealthiest kings, lived on the equivalent of $3 a day or less. Over the last 200 years, as the economic historian Deirdre McCluskey has put it, we've seen the great enrichment where, at a conservative estimate, living standards for most human beings have risen by some 3,000%. That great enrichment is the central fact of your life. The fact that you're sitting in this room is enough to tell me that. Central fact of mine as well. And what was its basis? What was it that created wealth and happiness that had previously been regarded as utterly unimaginable, as something only for an afterlife? Well, it was the idea of allowing everybody to specialize in what they did best and to trade under the law with an impartial magistracy so as to pursue their own interests by serving the people around them, by offering them a service for a fair price. That's the genius of the market system. And as conservatives, we should never lose sight of the fact that it's a basically moral case. That the argument for freedom and free markets is not simply that it has been a terrific instrument of poverty alleviation and of social justice, but that it's about human dignity and personal autonomy. It follows from this that not restricting people's commercial opportunities, in other words, that not telling them from whom they may buy and sell, is part of that market system. The case for free trade is just an extension of the case for private property and for personal dignity. Just as you shouldn't constrain people's life choices by consigning them according to their birth or according to their race or according to their religion, so you shouldn't tell people what they're allowed to buy and sell. That's, I hope in this audience, a fairly uncontentious, basic conservative nostrum. This idea of allowing people to do what they want was the thing that first lifted my country above the run of nations. Britain didn't get rich by owning hot, expensive tracts of real estate overseas. It was an expensive business. Nor did we get rich by backing strategic industries. We got rich because starting in the middle of the 19th century, we reduced barriers to trade. And the result was to put more money into the pockets of ordinary people. Visitors from overseas to Victorian England were astonished to see that ordinary people, working people, could afford watches and china and glass, cutlery and more than one suit of clothes. Now, at the time that we made that change, that we stopped raising barriers to trade, there was, of course, just as there always is, an awful lot of concern. People said, well, the real work is in agriculture. Proper jobs are on the land. These newfangled machines, they're never going to employ enough people. What are all the masses going to do when the jobs run out? Of course, exactly the same argument that was then later made when we moved from manufacturing to services. Oh, it's not real work, it's not real jobs. And yet, standards of living rose solidly, as did employment throughout that period. Why? Because if you no longer have to work 6 or 7 days a week simply to afford the most basic things, food and shelter, then you've freed up time and resources to do other things. And that's where you create the new markets, and that's where you create the new prosperity. And this was the basic insight of the free traders, that allowing normal people to keep more of their money because prices would come down if there were more trade and more competition. That would be what would drive economic growth at home. Why am I making this argument again? Why does it need making when it's so obvious? Every country that's followed this path has outperformed the ones that haven't. The Singapores and the Hong Kongs and the Australias and the New Zealands, all of them did well by dropping their barriers. Singapore, the day it became independent, had slightly less than half of Britain's GDP per capita. In 1960, per capita GDP in Singapore was 50% of ours. Now it is 194% of ours. Based on what? Right? What are the great natural resources of Singapore? Nothing. They have to import their drinking water. Literally nothing. The secret was that they invited the traffic and commerce of the world without restriction. Prices fell, they could specialize, and they went from being a steamy, equatorial, mosquito-ridden swamp into being the gleaming city-state they are today. No backing of strategic industries, no making Singapore great again, no need for barriers, simply inviting people to trade and allowing their own population to benefit. Okay, you can see where I'm going with this. This argument needs to be made in every country and in every generation. I'll tell you why. Because it is counterintuitive. Those 10,000 years that we've had civilization are, in evolutionary terms, the blink of an eye. We still have Paleolithic brains. We still have the instincts and intuitions of hunter-gatherers. And the whole idea of trade, the idea of depending on strangers for things that we can't see, is, in the exact sense of the word, counterintuitive. The idea that an object doesn't have intrinsic value, as it has intrinsic volume and intrinsic mass, is counterintuitive. How much heartache and bloodshed has been caused down the years because people couldn't understand this? How many anti-capitalist riots and pogroms because people thought that selling something for a different price was somehow unnatural, that it was profiteering, that it was speculation? It's because it's running up against 1,000,000 years of evolution. The modern economy, based on incredibly long and diverse supply chains, on things that we can't see, is so at odds with a brain that was designed for the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. A brain designed to want to provide against famine, to hoard things. The whole idea of not being self-dependent feels wrong, however much we see that it works in practice. And that is why it is always possible to make an argument that we should be backing our own people, standing up for our own industries, even though in practice, whenever you apply policies that distort or attenuate trade, it's your own people who suffer the most. Let me give you the classic US example. The price of sugar in this country is about twice what it is on world markets. Always has been. Sugar has been protected and subsidized pretty much since the revolution here. Result: because confectioners and candy makers can't afford to operate with that level of artificially high price, they move. They've moved in large numbers to Canada and to Mexico. How big are the numbers? Well, look, it depends which measurement you use. The Peterson Institute has looked at this, and as have various other economists, but somewhere, depending on who you trust, somewhere between 8 and 17 jobs are lost in food processing for every job propped up in the production of sugar on plantations in Florida. So why does it happen? Well, here I'm afraid I'm going to make a grubby political observation. The 17 people, or at least the 8 people, don't know who they are yet. Right? These are putative jobs. These are jobs that exist only in the subjunctive. These are not people who can vote and are, of course, dispersed across 50 states. Whereas the guy hacking at the sugar cane in Florida happens to live in an electorally important state, so people take his opinion very seriously. It's this problem that free trade brings: dispersed gains, but concentrated losses. Now, I should say, by the way, that the real beneficiary, of course, of these distortions in sugar price are not the guys working on the plantations. Their wages are dictated by the supply of labor. It's, of course, the people who own the plantations, who give immense sums of money to both parties, as well as running various political action committees. And this is the reality. Distortions of trade, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, are a way of transferring wealth from new industries to old ones, from entrepreneurs and startups to industries that have unionized labor and political pull. And frankly speaking, they're a way of transferring wealth from the poor to the rich. And yet it keeps happening because of those four words: dispersed gains, concentrated losses, and because our brains always struggle with the idea of free trade. We saw an example just 2 months ago with these tariffs on the Bombardier aircraft. It's exactly like the sugar. By depriving Delta Airlines and other US operators of the chance to buy the cheapest technology, the administration is causing jobs that would otherwise have come into being in the aviation sector now not to exist. Those cabin crew and those pilots who would have been there because of more profitability and greater productivity and competitiveness now won't exist. They therefore won't have their pay packet to spend on other things and stimulate the rest of the economy. Every US air passenger will pay fractionally more for the price of his ticket than he otherwise would have done if we'd been able to buy these cheaper aircraft. Now, to one individual, the sum is small. Add it all together, and that's quite a lot of money that is now not being spent on stimulating the general US economy. So whatever that tariff does, it is not standing up for America. It is plainly destroying American jobs and destroying American prosperity. And in this particular case, it's not even doing so in order to prop up one protected and politically connected industry, because in this particular case, Boeing wasn't bidding for the contract which he was objecting to the Bombardier aircraft on. Right? So it's having all these costs without even any notional gain. The aircraft are now, of course, being built with Airbus. So it is a total loss on every level. And yet, there will always be a constituency of people who say, well, don't bore me with the details, we've got to stand up for our guys. And my friends, we have to make the argument. We who understand the importance of property, of personal freedom, we have to make the argument that the best way of maximizing the prosperity of this, as of any other nation, is to leave people free, to let them make their decisions, to allow capital to optimize, to move the rocks and let the grass grow. Just as government ownership of industries is almost always a disaster, just as government intervention in any market fails, so the idea of not allowing people to trade is exactly the same argument as socialism. It always ends up failing because politicians are bad at second-guessing what works best on the ground. How do you win this argument? Given that it's so counterintuitive, given that it's so difficult, given that it's running up against 1 million years of evolution encoded in our genomes, how do we win the argument for free trade? Well, at the risk of sounding trite, you just do it. Once you do it, nobody seriously wants to go back. There's no clamour in Australia or New Zealand, let alone in Hong Kong or Singapore, to go back to an age of tariffs and regulations. And it's here that we now have this terrific opportunity. The United Kingdom, for the first time in 45 years, is now going to get the chance to do its own trade deals. Up until now, all of our commerce has been conducted on our behalf by the European Commission in Brussels. Now we have the chance to sign our own deals. And of course, up at the top of the list of the most important trading partners we have is the United States. The US is our single biggest trading partner, it's our single biggest investor, and indeed we are the single biggest investors here. Every day, 1 million Americans turn up to work for companies owned by British firms. And every day, 1 million Brits clock into work for American-owned companies. Which is kind of what you'd expect, isn't it? Given the obvious links of language and law, of culture and commerce. But what hasn't been able to flow up until now is the trade. And that can now change. We have the opportunity to do something big and bold and beautiful. We have the opportunity to strike a different kind of free trade agreement, one that is not corporatist, that isn't based on the interests of big business, but that is based on markets, on maximizing the opportunities for consumers. What does a trade deal of that sort look like? Well, it's a very short deal that says what is legal in your country is legal in ours and vice versa. That's it. That's all you need. Mutual recognition. Mutual recognition of regulatory standards, mutual recognition of professional qualifications. There is one such trade deal extant in the world today. Just to reassure you that this is not some impossible platonic ideal. It can happen. It exists between Australia and New Zealand. With some reservations, right? Because this is a sublunary world and there is nothing perfect even in Australia. But at least you can get the broad principle of reciprocity. But here's the thing, okay? Australia and New Zealand, they've got this great trans-Tasman trade deal. It's wonderful. They've gone 25 years each without a single quarter of negative growth. But with the best will in the world, they are quite remote countries. Imagine the same deal between the biggest economy in the world and the fifth biggest economy in the world. At that stage, the implications go beyond the participating countries. This is something of potentially planetary significance. If we can do this with genuine openness, I mean, the president speaks with great superlatives, as he sometimes does about this. He says it's going to be the most beautiful trade deal, the best. Right. What does that mean? It means getting rid of all tariff and non-tariff barriers and saying, for example, if a drug is approved by your FDA, it's automatically good enough to be sold in the UK and vice versa. And vice versa. Think of what impact that would have on the price of pharmaceuticals in the United States. The same with food, with textiles, and all the rest of it. Now, on both sides there's going to be a backlash. There always is. Because there are vested interests who have learned how to make a handy living out of the status quo. That's just what happens. However distorted, however irrational, however arbitrary the rules, people, being ingenious, learn how to turn them into a livelihood. This is what Milton Friedman meant when he talked about the tyranny of the status quo. So people will dig. I mean, the issue that they're digging in on in the United Kingdom is your delicious chickens, which you wash. You wash them in chlorine. I mean, there's more chlorine in a salad than in an American chicken, and you consume tons of them every year without any obvious deleterious impact. And yet, people who don't like America or don't like Trump or don't like trade or indeed don't like meat, we're very often the same people, there's a kind of a green left lobby here, have focused on chickens and indeed your delicious hormone-treated beef and saying this is, unacceptable and all the rest of it. Well, we need to face down those arguments. We need to show that it's up to consumers to make the choices, not up to us to tell them what they're allowed to pick and what they're not allowed to pick. And by the way, it's particularly irksome to hear this argument from people who delightedly tuck into your delicious beef whenever they're here, and so know that they are making a false argument. And the same will apply the other way around. The same will apply where you in this room will know better than I do how much the FDA will dig in, for example, to defend its entrenched position. That's what regulators do. It's what bureaucrats do the world over. But let's not lose sight of the prize, the billions that we could add to your economy and to ours. Not by needing to do anything as governments, simply by allowing people to choose their own best decisions. Isn't that the essence of conservatism? Isn't that the essence of freedom? I'm supposed to be talking about links between our country and our countries and the potential for a stronger Anglo-American alliance, but if the alliance between our two nations is about anything, surely it is about raising the individual above the collective rather than the reverse. A couple of people have asked me over the last couple of days what this flower is. It's something that everyone in Britain and in most of the Commonwealth wears at this time of year. It's commemorating veterans and casualties in our wars, particularly in the First World War, whose grisly centenary we've been living through in real time these past 3 years. Think of what it was that we were fighting for in that conflict. And then in the Second World War, and then again in the Cold War, your fathers and mine. We were fighting for a system where the law was raised above the state, where the rules were more important than the rulers, and where the individual was the basis of society, rather than being treated as part of a collective. In all three of those conflicts, countries that believed in personal freedom were pitted against countries that believed in the opposite. And thank God, our side was victorious. Now, next to those heroic wars, having a free trade agreement is the simplest thing. It doesn't involve any expenditure of blood or treasure. It simply involves stepping back and letting things happen. With your country in mind, shoulder to shoulder, I have no doubt that the best is yet to come.
Dan, thank you very much for that extremely robust defense of free trade and also the tremendous support for a US-UK free trade agreement, which will greatly benefit both the United States and the United Kingdom. It might be the two greatest nations on earth today. Dan, before I open the floor to questions from the audience, just an opening question for you with regard to the current Brexit negotiations between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Could you give an overview of where the negotiations are at the moment? Who do you see as the most difficult forces on the EU side at the moment, and who are the most sort of problematic foes of Brexit on the European continent from your vantage point in Brussels?
Thank you. Well, shall I just take questions from here after this, Niall? Will that be easier?
I think
So,
that'd be great.
if I may, before directly answering your question about where we've got to in the talks, let me just preface it by making one or two remarks about what's happened since the referendum. And I say this particularly in the unlikely event that there are any New York Times readers either in the room or watching online, because if you were to follow actually not just the New York Times, quite a lot of the broadcast media here as well, you might think that the United Kingdom is in some kind of political or economic meltdown, that we're regretting our decision and so on. So just a couple of facts for the record. It's been 500 days, 502 days or something since the vote. Since the vote, what's happened? Growth has increased. The stock exchange is at a record level. Unemployment has fallen to its lowest level in 42 years. There are more people in work now in the United Kingdom than ever before in our history, including, by the way, more EU nationals than ever before. They plainly don't think that there is any economic downturn because they're coming in considerable numbers. Manufacturing is up. Exports are up. On any measure, the country is prospering. And this is completely at odds with what we were told would happen during the campaign, not just by the Remain campaign, which is fair enough, but by the Treasury, the Bank of England, the OECD, the IMF, and so on. Not only is our economy stubbornly refusing to tank, but all of the other dire predictions that we were given during the campaign have spectacularly failed to materialise. We were told, for example, that if we voted to leave, but Scotland had voted the other way, that there would be another referendum and Scotland would walk out of the UK. In fact, support for Scottish separatism has collapsed, and the Scottish Prime Minister has shelved her plan for another vote because she knows what the outcome would be. We were told that our deal on immigration with the French would collapse and that all the refugees in Calais would be somehow transported to Kent, and France has in fact now reconfirmed the deal. I mean, all of the predictions that people made have turned out to be overly pessimistic. And yet, rather than behaving as rational human beings and saying, okay, maybe if I was wrong about it up until now, maybe I should cheer up about what happens next, they're behaving like apocalyptic doomsday cultists. When the end of the world doesn't happen, they never turn around and say, oh, maybe I was wrong about that. Oh, no, it's still coming. Just give it another couple of years. The calculations just need to be slightly tweaked. And of course, if you give it long enough, eventually there will be a downturn in the UK. We haven't abolished the economic cycle. And when it happens, they'll all jump up and down and say, oh, it's because of Brexit. I think the electorate knows better than that. So what's the likely outcome of the talks, and where's the opposition coming from? The opposition is mainly domestic, Niall. There are a number of people who are struggling to come to terms with the outcome of the vote. And they're struggling because this is a defeat of an entire political class. It's not just a defeat of the European ideology. It's the defeat of a kind of person who has had a cultural, intellectual and political hegemony since at least the Second World War. And it's very, very difficult for them to come to terms with having been told by the people politely, no thank you, we don't want any of your options, bring us a different menu. And so deep down, they still think that the decision can be reversed. That somehow, the country will come to its senses, despite the fact that in all the polls, if anything, there's been a slight firming of the Leave position, unsurprisingly, given the economic news. What's the biggest danger? The biggest danger is that people, to the extent that they've verbalized or rationalized the strategy, they're thinking to themselves, if this looks tough enough, if this becomes difficult and disagreeable enough, maybe the Leavers will just kind of drop the whole thing. And the danger is that they get the first part of that tactic, but not the second. In other words, that we get a suboptimal deal and we leave anyway. Because the leaving is now a legal fact. This is the point that all the analysis misses, right? Both houses of parliament have voted to trigger a process which means that on the 29th of March 2019, with or without a deal, the United Kingdom ceases to be a member of the EU. The only way to reverse that process, you just think about this to see how ridiculous it is. The only way to reverse that process, first of all, you'd need to get 2/3 of MPs to vote for an early dissolution of parliament, which in the current parliament means you'd need to get Labour and Conservative MPs both agreeing to vote for an early dissolution. It's difficult to see any opinion poll scenario where they would both simultaneously think that that was a good idea. Then you'd need to persuade one of the big parties to fight the next election on a platform of reversing the Brexit vote. Now, what happened at the last election is that 85% of people voted for pro-Brexit parties, and the three parties that wanted a second referendum, the Scottish National Party, the Liberals, and the Greens, all lost support. So it'd be a fairly big ask to get somebody to do this when the opinion polls have not moved. The party would then need to win on the basis of having a second referendum on the deal. It would then need to hold and win that referendum. To repeat, the opinion polls haven't budged, or if they have, it's been slightly in the Leave side's favour. Then Parliament would need to put that new referendum verdict through. Then the other 27 countries of the EU would all need to suspend it, and all of this would need to happen before the 29th of March of 2019. Do you know what? It's not going to happen. So Britain is leaving the EU. The only question now is, on what terms do we leave? And obviously the challenge here is to make it a cordial process that brings advantages to both sides. We want this to be mutually beneficial, and we want it to be amicable. We don't want to leave, for example, in a way that causes the euro crisis to flare up again. The last thing we want is to have economic turmoil on our doorstep among countries who are our friends and allies, and indeed our suppliers and our customers. And I think the same logic applies the other way around. The strangest idea has crept into British political discourse since the referendum, that somehow countries trade with each other as a favour. You keep hearing people saying, why should the EU let us stay in a free market if we're withdrawing from all the political union? Let us stay in the free market. So some kind of act of kindness. The answer to that question was given by the great sage of Kirkcaldy, Adam Smith, around about the time of when America was voting leave, when he said, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their self-interest. It is not from the benevolence of the European Union that we expect a trade deal, but from its regard to its self-interest. And I think it is overwhelmingly likely that there will be, and of course, not a perfect deal, because nothing is perfect, but a deal that leaves us happier because we're outside the political union but still connected in a broad nexus of a European single market, that leaves the other countries happier because they can push ahead with closer union without us. And I think they will look back and say we lost a bad tenant and we gained a good neighbour. Time for a couple more questions. Yes?
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Very good question.
Michael Maybach with Heritage Foundation. So I think some would say that you've just left a free trade arrangement, and Mr. Trump is talking about leaving NAFTA, which is another free trade agreement. So two questions in that sense. One is, should you look at a UK-US bilateral or a UK membership in NAFTA? Or do you have a view that multilateral agreements just are not a good idea?
The big difference between the EU and NAFTA is that NAFTA is a classical free trade area, whereas the European Union is a customs union. And the difference is the European Union therefore forbids its members to contract trade agreements with anybody else. So a free trade agreement is by far the more normal way of doing it, right? ASEAN or NAFTA or the European Free Trade Association, they are agreements to abolish tariffs and other trade barriers. The much more unusual model, which is the European Union customs union, typically it only exists when one country is effectively administering the external affairs of another. So, Swaziland is in a customs union with South Africa, the Palestinian territories are in a customs union with Israel. Putin has created a customs union for the same reason as the EU. He sees it as a political rather than an economic project. But the difference is this. There is no reason, from NAFTA's point of view, why the United States couldn't sign a bilateral deal with an EU country. The reverse is not true. Britain has to leave the EU in order to be able to contract a free trade agreement with the United States. Being in a customs union always affected us more adversely than any other member because we trade more outside the EU than any other state does. We're the only member state of the 28 that sells more than half of our exports outside the EU, and so we were always disproportionately clobbered by it. What do I think should happen? Well, you heard me set out my plan for what would be the ideal US-UK free trade agreement. I would see that as the beginning of something much bigger. Different way of doing trade. Something that gets away from the regulation and the corporatism of the Obama attempts at Atlantic and Pacific trade agreements, where you try and regulate all the standards, and you say, well, let's take the European and the Americans and push them all together, raise barriers to entry, and instead becomes about removing tariffs, removing barriers. Now, if we did that, and it worked, then any country can come along and say, we would like also to have mutual recognition of standards and qualifications, and where do we sign? I mean, I think the first to sign would presumably be Canada, which has a very close trade deal with the US and will soon have with the European Union and therefore with the UK. I don't think it'll be long before the EFTA countries also say, well, they've been fitfully talking about a trade deal with NAFTA for 20 years now. It would be an obvious move for Norway and Iceland and so on. I don't think it would be long before Australia and New Zealand joined in. And you've then got your coalition of the willing of free trade countries, right? Once you've got that, here we have a proper functioning market system based on mutual recognition. It is open to anyone else. You Taiwanese, Chileans, South Koreans, whatever, come in. All you have to do is accept the reciprocity. And that's a much, much better way of doing trade. And eventually, that will encompass most advanced economies. I saw Ted with his hand up, who's a great expert on trade.
Well, I guess I can shout loud enough so I don't need the microphone. Thank you, Dan. Fantastic address. As always, lucid and inspiring at the same time, so thank you. I wanted to return to the UK-EU negotiations, if I could. One of the things that I find most striking about them is that undoubtedly Brexit raises a lot of difficult issues. There's the Irish border issue, there's the trade issue, there's immigration, there are a range of sort of difficult problems to deal with. It's very striking that the British government has put forward a series of, by and large, I think, well-considered or at least serious efforts to address all of these issues, whereas the European Union in the negotiation has been interested so far in only one thing: money. How much is Britain going to contribute as payment, Danegeld, as it were, for moving on to the substantive round of the negotiations?
Okay.
Would you like to comment a little bit on the payment question versus the substance question?
Sure. I think we're getting towards the end, so if I may, I'll take any outstanding questions in a round. I saw Michael's hand up and one or two others, and then I'll answer them more collectively. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Pascal Siegel. I work at Ankara Consulting.
Mm-hmm.
So you described your ideal trade deal as akin to the Australian-New Zealand one. What's the appetite in the UK government for this?
Sure. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Brian Riley. I work here at Heritage as well. And my understanding is you've started a new organization dedicated to advance this crazy idea of letting people do what they want to do. And I wondered if you have a few minutes to tell us a little bit more about that.
Dan, glad to see you're as fluent as ever. I'm Stephen Smith, now a private citizen. Thankfully, what I once was in public or professional life is now irrelevant. I lived in the UK many years ago, way back in the last century, before indeed you were born, and then it seemed to be a reasonably prosperous society. But in my visits back since then, it has perceptibly become more prosperous. And a large part of this has to do with the Thatcher Revolution, as you call it. Mrs. Thatcher conducted her revolution while Britain was a member of the EU. And I recognize that the EU changed over time, but we need to unscramble some of the history here to see when the turn came that Britain could no longer control its destiny to the extent it did in the 80s and 90s.
Thank you. Okay, I'll We've got 10 minutes, so I think I'll just deal with those. Apologies for the people I haven't been able to come around. I'll start with Stephen's question, my high Tory friend. Can I make a general observation that I think is important and timely and needs to be said more often? A dangerous idea has crept into political discourse on both sides of the Atlantic, that there has been a stagnation in living standards, and that you explain the victory of Brexit, the victory of Trump, whatever, by the fact that unskilled workers, particularly in Western countries, have not got any better off over the last 20 years. And this is repeated by every economist. It's become almost a truism. And it's patently untrue. It's patently untrue. It is, of course, the fact that the entry into the global market of hundreds of millions of new workers has reduced the value of labour proportionate to capital. But it has also massively reduced the cost of living. And the next time somebody says nothing has improved in 20 years, if you're old enough, cast your mind back to how we actually lived 20 years ago, which Stephen will remember. Some of you in this room will not. Okay? I can remember how we lived in 1997. There were 4 channels on TV in the UK. There was obviously no wiki, no Wi-Fi, no Uber. There were no cheap flights. EasyJet operated one route in 1997 from Luton to Amsterdam. You just think of the impact on people's living standards of being able to travel abroad cheaply. You couldn't get a decent coffee. Starbucks hadn't yet taken over the whole of London. There was a predecessor chain called Seattle Coffee that was just beginning to introduce people to coffee that tasted like coffee. I mean, I could bore you with a picture of what life was like before you had Spotify and when you had to go to Blockbusters. But all I would say is anyone who actually had to live for a week, as we did in 1997, would not come back and say living standards have stagnated. It is a palpable falsehood. Okay? People are getting off. It is true that people in the third world have got better off much more quickly than poor people in rich countries, of course, because they're starting from a much lower place. But the human race as a whole, except in parts of the world where there are blockades or wars, is getting better off all the time. You do it, of course, by putting power in people's hands, by treating people as responsible enough to make their decisions in their own interest. If you give, as Margaret Thatcher's guru Keith Joseph used to say, if you give people more responsibility, they will behave more responsibly. It's a lesson we all apply when we bring up children, and it applies to electorates as a whole. So I'll take the rest in order. Ted's question about the money. I mean, you're right, Ted, that the issues currently being discussed, the status of EU migrants who are already in the UK and vice versa, the Irish border, these are not insoluble problems. When people talk about the Irish border, for example, they talk almost as though we were still in the 19th century, where a border post involved a mustachioed customs officer with a top hat and epaulets and opening all your bags. These days, customs procedures happen in advance and online. If you look at the EU's external borders with friendly countries like Switzerland or Norway, frankly, the physical infrastructure is minimal. But even what they have on the Norwegian-Swedish border is vestigial. Right? It wouldn't be put in today. If there were not a unionized workforce there wanting to keep the few remaining customs posts, nobody would be building them now. There's absolutely no need for physical borders. And that's even before we get to blockchain, which might have been invented to make all customs procedures redundant. I mean, it's odd that it's the Eurosceptics who are accused of living in the past, and then there's this absolute refusal to see where technology has led. It does come down, of course, to money, because every organization becomes primarily interested in its own budget. Even the really free market ones. There will be people in the Heritage Foundation who are really much more interested in the budget of the Heritage Foundation than they are in the good work of spreading the gospel on free trade. And so they should be, because otherwise there wouldn't be a Heritage Foundation, right? I mean, that's just what happens. And if that happens in a basically conservative outfit like this one, you can imagine how much truer that is of the European Commission, which has for a long time sustained itself by transferring wealth from everybody else to its own pockets. What should be the British response? Well, I come back to what I said about wanting a good relation with our allies and our neighbours. I'm sure that the European Commission's lawyers are telling them the same thing that our government lawyers are telling us, which is that if we leave without a deal, there is a minimal residual financial obligation. One or two bills to be paid, but it's a tiny amount. So the question is, should Britain be prepared to take a generous interpretation of those outstanding liabilities in return for an amicable overall deal? And I think the answer is yes, because we want the European Union to succeed. Churchill's original vision, going right back to his Zurich speech after the war, he called, everyone always quotes this bit in Brussels, this is where he said, I'm going to astonish you, I want a United States of Europe. That's the bit that they all quote in the European Parliament. They never quote the bit he went on to say, which is, Britain will look on as a friend and sponsor, along with the United States. Well, that seems to me a great outcome, that we should want a successful European Union to whom we are linked, not only with economic links, but with military, security, policing, and so on, but on the basis that we live under our own laws, that we are an ally rather than a province. A little bit like the relationship between the US and Canada, right? You have on your border an independent country which has about as close an institutional relationship with this republic as is possible without being part of it. And, give and take the Bombardier tariff and one or two little disputes, it's worked out okay. There hasn't been a war for over 100 years. It's working. I think that should be our deal, to be kind of like a Canada to Europe, with a federation on our doorstep, to whom we are friendly, but we're not part of it. And yes, I think that, if you look at Israel, at Switzerland, Norway, they do make contributions to various EU projects and participate in them. And that seems to me not an unreasonable outcome for us. We're not just going to be a friendly third country like South Korea or somewhere where geography doesn't give us that option. Pascal asked whether there is appetite in the UK government for an Australia-New Zealand type deal. It's a very good question. You have to remember that we have no institutional memory when it comes to trade. We have no expertise because we haven't done it for 45 years. We've had to contract out all our trade policy to Brussels. And so we don't have the infrastructure that you have here automatically of kind of think tanks and people who specialize in this and so on. And therefore, we had to turn to friendly countries to supply us with some of the qualified personnel. And the countries to which we turned, I'm glad to say, were Australia and New Zealand, first and foremost. And these are the countries which have been, historically, over the last 20, 30 years, the biggest drivers of trade liberalization. Unilateral trade liberalization, if necessary. I mean, this is the thing. They didn't make their tariff reductions reciprocal. They realized that, as one of their negotiators put it, just because the other guy is dropping rocks in his harbour, you don't respond by dropping rocks in your harbour. So I think the strongest possible indication of where the UK government's thinking is on an Australia-New Zealand type trade deal is the fact that they have turned to Australia and New Zealand to supply them with the negotiators, which I regard as a very happy and healthy development. And then Brian invited me to talk about the Institute for Free Trade. Well, I gave you the basic, as it were, election broadcast about why free trade is a good thing. And I hope I explained why it is that this argument is never won. Why? Because being counterintuitive, it's always freaky to people when they hear it for the first time. Somebody needs to be out there making the case to each new generation that comes cold to it. And that now that we have our trade policy back, is the role for the Institute for Free Trade. We launched at the end of September in the Foreign Office with Boris Johnson and with our Trade Minister, Liam Fox. We are looking to win the arguments and to go out and show, in very practical and concrete terms, where the benefits are. And that, I'll be frank, the important, there's no getting away from this, the important trade deal for us in terms of volume of trade is obviously with the United States. If you exclude the EU and the handful of countries through whom we have extant trade deals through the EU, the rest of the world, about half of that is trade with the US. For us, it's by far the single biggest, and it's our single biggest trading partner. And so I have no doubt that there will be something called a US-UK free trade agreement 2 years from now. I think both governments are plainly committed to it. But the challenge is to make it worthwhile, that we don't just mildly tweak and improve the current deal, and that we don't repeat the mistakes of TTIP, that we don't make it a regulatory and corporatist, at least in part, process, but that we make it about the extension of freedom and markets. But in order to win the argument at home, it can't just be about the US-UK free trade agreement. We need also to be emphasizing the opportunities for some of the poorest countries in the world. The first overseas conference organized by the Institute for Free Trade was in Kampala. Africa has been historically very badly treated by European tariffs, particularly by agrarian protectionism. There's now been a tariff reduction for the poorest countries in Africa, but it has not been matched by a removal of non-tariff barriers. There's still a great deal of protectionism. Africa is still in many ways treated as an economic colony. For example, you are able to export raw coffee beans to the EU without any tariffs, green coffee. You may not export roasted coffee. You can export cocoa beans but not chocolate. Germany makes more money from the re-export of finished coffee, Germany alone, than the whole of Africa makes by selling its coffee beans. Now, this is where, when the Prime Minister talks about Britain being a global leader in free trade, this is where we can recover the moral case for what we're doing. You know, free trade doesn't just mean that you get cheaper iPhones, right? It is life-transforming for some of the poorest people on the planet. It's lifted 2 billion people out of poverty. And that process is accelerating. And the falls in poverty have been fastest in the bits of the world that have abandoned autarky and joined the market system, particularly those countries in Africa and Asia that have joined global markets. History furnishes us, and in fact, contemporary geopolitics furnishes us with lots and lots of laboratory examples here of comparable countries where one is in the WTO and trading freely and the other one isn't. You know, look at Colombia versus Venezuela. Look at Vietnam versus Laos. Look at Bangladesh versus Pakistan. You know, always joining the global market system raises the standards of your poorest people. I'll leave you with one thought because we're approaching the end, and it's this paradox. For almost the whole of history until after the Second World War, no one would have seen free trade as a conservative cause. If you look at the great exponents of free trade in Britain, the Adam Smiths and the David Ricardos and the Richard Cobdens, they were radicals. The kinds of people who supported free trade were the kinds of people who held progressive opinions on other subjects. They wanted to limit the power of the crown. They wanted to extend the franchise. They wanted to reduce the privileges of the church. They wanted to extend education and give the masses more of a say in public life. How bizarre that at some point in the last half century, people who see themselves as progressive have now turned against the system that has done more than anything else ever invented to reduce poverty and spread social justice in the most underprivileged parts of the world. We need to recover, and the modern left needs to look at how it lost the idea that all of those great free traders had, and that they all saw very clearly. They understood protectionism for what it was. It was a racket that transferred money from the poor to the rich, and it still does.
Dan, I know you have to run to an important meeting on Capitol Hill, and we're very grateful to you for a tremendous speech and also a brilliant Q&A afterwards. And Dan, we wish you all the best with your work in Brussels and also with the Institute for Free Trade, an extremely important new organization that will play a key role, I'm sure, in advancing a US-UK free trade deal. Thank you to everybody here for joining us today, and we hope to welcome you back at the Heritage Foundation in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much.